is that from?
This is a ram's horn.
A what?
A ram's horn?
Ram's horn. Mouton ram or?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
My wife got it for me. Here.
Well, all of them I've ever seen are crooked like that.
My wife got it for me from Israel. I'm not sure where she got it from.
Yeah.
And my friend drilled a hole. It's actually about 2-3
Oh boy.
So
Yeah, just about right. Just a little over, about a half an inch or so.
So, if you want me to.
Well, yeah. Play it first.
Do.
Are you going to play a melody?
No.
Or? Okay.
But when I blow the shofar for people who haven't heard it before, I do kind of go over what it represents. I have 180 verses here, so I'm not going to go through all of those. It's take a long time. So I'm just going to summarize real quick what the shofar represents in the scriptures. And the word shofar actually happens about 73 times or so. And there's another word, yovel, which also is a word for the ram's horn. But in summary, there's about 12 different meanings. Redemption, substitution, like the ram that was substituted for Isaac. The Lord's power at Mount Sinai, when he gave the Torah, the Ten Commandments to the Israelites. You could hear the ram's horn blowing on Mount Sinai. Atonement, it was blown during the Feast of Atonement. Victory over strongholds, when you see in Joshua when they blew the ram's horns and the walls came falling down. Judgment, as we see, you guys have been studying in the book of Revelation. Warning sound of the watchman. It was sounded as a warning, the watchman on the wall, when the enemy was coming.
It's in Ezekiel, isn't it?
The voice of God, in the Psalms you see it as the voice of God, and also in the book of Revelation. They sounded it during the year of Jubilee. The word Yovel in Hebrew is where we get the word Jubilee from, and that's also a horn. And they would sound it during the year of Jubilee, of joy. And an instrument of praise. I just attended a Messianic conference last week, and there was about 50 of these things going off during the praise and worship. So, and some of them were really cool. I had to go up to some guys and say, "Where y'all get your ram's horns?" Because some of them blew them really bad, and some of them blew them pretty well. So,
That's like a group of bagpipers getting together.
yeah.
Some people think it's music.
Sometimes it goes really well with the music, and sometimes it doesn't. I blow it on our Friday night home group, our Spanish home group, part of this church. It's also blown during the Rosh Chodesh, which is the new moon, the monthly new moon, and it also represents the return of the Messiah in Isaiah 27:13, and it's also indicative of the coronation of a king. And during Rosh Hashanah, which is the Feast of Trumpets in the synagogue, they blow the shofar about 100 times, and they'll get one person in each corner during the service, and they'll blow it 100 times. So the guys that are chosen for that have to have a lot of air. I love the Feast of Trumpets because that's when they blow the shofar 100 times, and it's representative of the coming King Messiah. So when I blow it, I think of all these things, and I also am reminded of when Yeshua comes back, Jesus comes back, with the sound of a trumpet, and it's going to be like not like anything we've ever heard before. So I've been under the weather for the last 2 days, so hopefully this will come out well. And they blow it usually once, 3 times, 9 times, and then the last one is the Shofar Hagadol, the great shofar blast, and that's where I blow it until I just run out of breath. So, all right.
Thank you, Dan. I had some people, friend live next door who was named Ben Gurion.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, so always happy to meet Benjamins.
All right. Well, thank you for providing me.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
And I'll blow whatever you guys want.
Okay. You're welcome to stay, but you don't have
I'll
to.
stay.
Okay. All right. I don't think that he said anything that, except the blowing at the at the year of Jubilee, that we hadn't covered. The material that and the approach that we're using to analyze the book of Revelation emphasizes that the trumpets are trumpets of warning. Now, and that's from the Ezekiel passage, where a watchman on the walls, if he saw an enemy coming, he was to sound the trumpet of warning. And if he did, and nobody rose to the defense and the city fell, he was exonerated of guilt. But if he didn't, then he was guilty for what happened to the city. And so these trumpets here represent God's intervention using the whole creation. Now, it's good to think of God as Lord of creation. Many times in the Old Testament, the God of Israel is identified as the maker of heaven and earth, because all other gods, goddesses, semi-gods, demigods, no gods at all of the ancient world, all are seen as forming some part of creation, but they all start with matter already in place. You've heard the joke, haven't you, about the atheistic scientist that was going to call God, have a contest with God, and he said, "I can create life." He says, "Okay, I'll take up your challenge." And he says, "Start." He says, "Well, I've got to have something to start with." He says, "You got to make your own." And that's the difference between the God who is maker of heaven and earth, Lord of creation. Now,
isn't the kind of a Hebraism or a phrase that's often used of God as King of the universe? And
it's what, Olam?
Melech haolam.
Yeah.
Melech is
Melech. See, I know a little Hebrew.
But
Yeah.
I seem to hear that a lot when I watch movies or
Okay.
There's a prayer that they say before they bless the bread and the juice. It's always said, "Blessed be the Lord God, King of the universe."
right.
Yes. Olam is also connected with this, the ages. And I'm not going to go into that because that's a different area we're talking about. But one thing that we were talking about as we closed last week is you have to keep in mind that the same event can have more than one purpose. I think one of the things that vitiates many people's teaching from the Word of God is that they want an event, or they think of an event as having one and only one purpose. God is more complex than that.
Just like this.
And the universe itself is more complex than that. And it's one of the things that makes God so great. In my book about just eighth day of creation, I point out that in a scientific terminology, God is in direct controlling contact with every point in space and time. That's what it means that He is infinite, and that He's infinitely in control. And see, that's through time and instantaneously at any time. That's true. So when God is going to use his power over the created universe to warn people, he can use all of them. See, we had, I'm going to go back over the trumpets. The first angel sounded his trumpet, and there was a great hail, fire mixed with blood, and so on. A description that fits one of the plagues of Egypt. And so there will be on earth, due to earthly things, this can be, well, I'm going to use some concrete examples. I'm not saying that I know those are what is talked about here. I'm just using them as examples. Mount St. Helens blowing up. First time in 157 years that it had erupted. There was other things that happen on Earth. I think of earthquakes as one of the catastrophes that God can use to warn people. Now, remember, and I want you to, I'm going to hammer this until it becomes part of your way of thinking. It can also be, see, following this are going to be bowls of wrath, or God's anger poured out on the earth. Now, the same event can be both a warning to some people and a judgment to others. Now think about that. And the last thing I said of significance last week, because I can't remember what I said, the absolute last word, that I said that was of significance was that the death of righteous people is qualitatively different from the death of the unrighteous, the unbeliever. Precious in the sight of God is the death of his saints. That is, if you die a believer, your verdict will always, in the coming judgment, is already sealed. You're not guilty. You know that you are, as according to Apostle Paul, that you're saved, which in all probability in every place it's used in the New Testament means to be saved from death. That's the great last enemy that you're saved from. And so remember that the same earthly event, an earthquake, some people, it's a judgment. It's God's wrath because they die unsaved, outside the covenant of God. Come on in. They die outside the covenant of God. But for those who are believers, and I keep it, it's a blessing. Now, it's not a blessing that we particularly want to invoke, except maybe in some circumstances, but we know by the promise of God that it is a blessing. Now, so you have the first trumpet. You have the second trumpet. It looked like a mountain cast into the sea. And we talked last week about an article I read about where would you want a cubic mile of meteorite to fall, on New York City, or, well, we won't go there, on a big city, or on the ocean. And most people will say on the ocean. But according to the calculations this writer did, You don't want it to fall in the ocean because it would call a 7-year cloud winter. And in 7 years, I think nearly all life would be gone. So, but this represents God's use of the sea. And the Israelites were especially afraid of the ocean. For them, the ocean represented chaos. The Hebrew word for sea is also the word for a Babylonian goddess, and that's not accidental, because they can see the Babylonian goddess was a goddess of chaos, and the Jews just weren't good seamen. The Phoenicians were. You know, that's what Jonah did. He got on a boat and headed the other way, away from Nineveh. And a great storm arose. And I can just hear the Jews who read that to begin with saying, it serves him right. He shouldn't have gotten on the ocean. So the ocean then will be God's instrument of warning. Talked with you a little bit about the 500-year flood that happened in this area on August 2nd, 1978, when a tropical storm dumped 43 inches of rainfall on the headwaters of the Medina River. We could use that today. It would nearly fill up Medina Lake. But we don't want it because it really was devastating. And it was a warning. You know, nobody has gone back and built homes in that valley of the Medina River. You go by there and it's empty where there used to be homes. So you see, that was a warning. But there were 9 people drowned, and I wouldn't presume to know whether they died as believers or unbelievers or mixed. But again, I'm just using these examples so that you realize these things are happening right now. And they will happen from the time of the ascension of the Messiah until his appearance again. With the blowing of the shofar, it says in 1 Thessalonians. It will be the sound of a trumpet. And the dead in Christ will rise, and then those that are alive will be changed in the twinkling of an eye. We will rise and meet him in the sky, then to be with him forever, or throughout the coming age is a better translation. And that's here. Going ahead then, the third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky, and a third of the river, springs, and water. The name was wormwood, or bitter. The waters of Marah in the Old Testament is the idea. God uses, see, that flood that we talked about. There's great floods. Every year you read someplace in the United States where they have almost a record flood. It was a year or so ago where there had been a real heavy, wet snowfall in the late spring. And then it got warm enough that everything was thawing at once, and then they had downpours and great amounts of water came up. I preached one time in where was the great flood in Pennsylvania? Johnstown. And I can see why there was a flood, because the town is built on a V-shaped valley with a river running right down the middle of it, and the hills are about like this, and had a lot of rain, and a lake, built an artificial lake up in the mountains that wealthy men had built as a place to hunt and fish and go in the summertime, summer resort. That broke, and the wall of water came down. Then the fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars. A third of the day was without light, and also a third of the night. And I must confess that I don't know exactly what this refers to. But we talked, about how hot places, how the world's record I thought it was 136, but I was out of date because somebody came. It was what's his name? I can't ever remember it. He comes to this class sometimes. Anyway, he found one that after 90 years, a day in Death Valley had exceeded that. It was 139 degrees. I cannot imagine what a 139-degree day would feel like. I've only been to 127. That was in Santa Elena Canyon in Big Bend. And that's hot. They have a sign there that says, don't even try to walk this trail unless every one of you has at least a quart of water to drink. It's about half a mile, maybe 3/8 of a mile. Down, you have to go down into the mouth of Santa Elena Canyon and back up. And it will be a little less than a mile total walking. And you will need that quart of water if it's 127 degrees, and wish you had more. So perhaps that's the kind of thing. Again, the idea is this: the prayers of the persecuted, martyred saints rise to the Father. And the Father says, don't you get all upset. I will avenge your death. And there, I want to emphasize the practicality of this. If we see wickedness in the world, and we do, and if we see people slaughtering believers because they are believers, and we do see that, our job is to pray. Now, as I explained last week, I'm not a pacifist. There's times when military is necessary, but it is not in defense of the faith. We are not like the Muslims. We do not conquer people in order to convert them to Christ. If somebody was converted to Christ because we held a gun on their head, they would not be converted. The tool of conversion is the proclamation of the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. And that's the only tool that we can use. Now, we come to a break. As I watched, what?
Significance of 1/3 there?
Well, don't you remember what we talked about 1/3? It's a large thing, something, but it is not nearly all. In other words, catastrophes can be overwhelmingly large. Think about the
I remember.
Yeah.
But not in this class, and that's why.
What?
I remember
Okay.
other times, I don't know if it was in this class, I missed one, you might have talked about it last week.
Yeah, we did.
I wasn't here, so.
You weren't here. Okay. Well, you should have.
But I know.
Okay, you should have looked at. You did. The idea is that God will never destroy the earth. Not only will he not destroy it by a flood, he will not destroy it until the final judgment comes. And this is one of those things, I get so tired of people that are going to calculate the exact time when God's going. You know, I think that is the height of presumptuousness. Jesus himself says, even the Son of Man doesn't know when that's going to happen. Only the Father. And his conclusion is, be ready, alert all the time. Now, that's hard. So there's a lot of, and pardon the slang, a lot of jackleg preachers around in the world that want to make a name for themselves by predicting, or they want to exercise ungodly control over their congregations by scaring, if you'll pardon the word, scaring the hell out of them, as some people do.
If they were right, it wouldn't get much for it, would they?
No, they wouldn't. But what I'm getting at is, that's what a third means. No matter how great the catastrophe is. One of the most thorough, complete things I've watched recently in the way of a catastrophe was the tsunami in Japan. And it was overwhelming. I don't think there's ever been that great a catastrophe that had live TV of it. And it was almost like slow motion if you saw it. But those tsunami, the waves though, were moving at 30 or 40 miles an hour. But when I'm sure a lot of those were satellite pictures. And so when you're that far away from them, it looks kind of slow, you know. But it was so devastating, so complete. But not everything. And there was results all over the world. Do you know why there were so many gray automobiles the next 2 or 3 years? Because all the paint companies in Japan that made these super lacquer finishes were wiped out. And that's one of the things. I read a book called Storm. It was written in 1944, and I read it about 1950. And it's about a young meteorologist that comes back from service in World War II and becomes a weather forecaster in the Weather Bureau in San Francisco, California, and a storm he traces. Have you ever heard the song they call the wind Mariah? That's based on that book, because just for his own private sake, he named the storm Mariah. And it showed how interdependent we are. We forget that. Would you flick the light switch for me? And back on. Do you realize what that represents right there? Electricity has to be generated, transmitted, and used in the same second. Had you ever thought about that? You don't store it. And so we've got people. Now we have computers, but people are watching the computers that keep the cyclage of that current to within 0.02% of the same. And no matter how big a load, cloud comes up, 1 million people turn on their lights. You got to have the power there. And I wish Christians had this view of how dependent we are on each other. People that we don't even know. We're great gripers. We gripe because it takes so long to get through the lines at an airport. Have you ever been behind that and seen how many people it takes to get you on an airliner on time and with food ready, and trained pilots and cabin crew, and get you off of the ground at the time they have promised? We are dependent on each other. And I think that's one of the things that I get from the book of Revelation. What happens to the people of God is not an isolated event, but it is a cosmic event. It changes the way God runs the universe. When we pray, our prayers, as C.S. Lewis says someplace, are integrated into the way God runs the whole universe. Our sins cause the universe to be subject to meaninglessness, Paul says in Romans 8. So our righteousness also involves the whole universe. But in the reverse way, it begins to inject meaning back into it, which will come fully to pass when God creates a new heaven and a new earth. And that's the way the book of Revelation is going to end. Now we come to an interlude. And he says, as I watched, I heard an eagle that was flying in midair call out in a loud voice, "Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth." Do you know what woe means? I'm going to paraphrase it. God will do bad things to somebody. It's oi in Hebrew, and I always hate to have a Hebrew speaker. You don't claim that, I see. Okay, but it does, and the old what we think is a typical Jewish expression, oy vey, means woe is to me. And I translate it most of the time as God will do bad things, because both the word bless and the word curse or woe mean to the Hebrew mind that God will do that. I do not translate in the opening parts of the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the poor in spirit. I say, God will bless those who are poor in spirit. Because the idea behind it is, it's God's action. When Joshua drew up the children of Israel on Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, one of them talked about the blessings that God would give to people if they kept the law, and the other half talked about God's threats of destruction to those. That's what this eagle is. He's saying things are going to get worse. I'm just paraphrasing, but that's it. Now, we don't usually think of an eagle as a carrion bird. But you know, they do eat carrion. They will eat, they'll kill and eat fresh meat too. But if they get a carcass, they'll eat them. And so the ancient peoples called all carrion birds eagles, or the same word that is translated eagle. haven't translated Revelation yet in my New Testament translation, and I've already started debating on how I'm going to translate this word eagle, and I haven't come to any conclusion yet. So this helps me, say, talking about this. Because of the trumpet blasts about to be sounded by the other three angels. In other words, he is warning that the end is going to be worse than the beginning. And remember, we talked about, when we were talking about the principles of interpretation, that as we progress through these minor sections, and this is what, the third minor section, more emphasis would be given on the end time, the eschatological events, each time, until in the final section, it is almost entirely about the eschaton, the end of time. And here it is. See, going to have 7 trumpets. We got 4 of them, and now there's going to be 3 last ones, and it's going to be worse.
The Expanded Bible uses the term doom.
Well, but do you know, this is one of those factoids that I know that come up, boil up. Do you know what the word doom really means? Anybody? In Anglo-Saxon English, it means tax. Its base, where it came into our language, was that William the Conqueror wanted to know how much he could tax England after he took it over. So he sent his representatives into the whole of England, and they listed the property and the buildings in every place in England, and estimated its tax value. And this was in a book called the Doomsday Book, which is in the British Museum. And if you can read Anglo-Saxon with a little mixture of Norman French in it, which I can't do either one, you could know the description of every piece of property in England. And so when you talk about Doomsday, that's April 15th. Okay. The 5th angel sounded his trumpet, and I saw a star that had fallen from the sky to the earth. The star was given the key to the shaft of the abyss. Now, what is the abyss? Have you ever heard of the word, the adjective abysmal? What does it mean?
Worst of the worst.
What?
Worst of the worst. Awful.
Well, it literally means darkness. The abysmal. Now, the abyss is a dark place. It is a Greek mythological term for a deep pit, the bottom of which is Hades, the unseen place. This is Satan. There is more than one place in the Bible where Satan is seen as a fallen star. Now, I do not buy the whole plot of Paradise Lost, the Milton's play about Satan. Now, it's probably reasonably accurate. Now, if you ever heard a qualified statement, I used probably and reasonably accurate. But in the details, and the passage of Scripture that he quotes from the book of Isaiah, where it says, "Oh, the days, how great is your fall, O day star, Lucifer," and that's a name that both Milton and people since then have given to Satan, is not talking about Satan's fall from heaven. In the context, it's talking about the arrogance of Cyrus the Persian, whom God is going to use to bring the children of Israel, or a fraction of them, back from Babylonian captivity. And even before it happens, Isaiah says he's going to be punished for his arrogance, because from Cyrus's viewpoint, it was his policy he was following. Sounds like what was it, Herod Antipas, I believe it was, who fell because he accepted the accolade. That's not the voice of a man, it's the voice of a God. And he fell and his worms ate him up, or came out of his stomach and ate him. That's in the book of Acts. Okay, so this is Satan. Now, I'm going to introduce an idea that I know, even after years of study, so little about, that you're just going to have to be satisfied with what I do know. And it's what is going to happen close to the time the end is coming. And it seems, now I'm trying to hedge my bets as much as I can, that there will be a short period of time in which evil will seem to have triumphed. Even Jesus himself, in a very opaque passage in the 18th chapter of Luke, when he's talking about the woman, the persistent widow, and the unjust judge, he ends that by saying that, you ought to keep praying so that God will act. He's better than the unjust judge, so he'll act better. But, and I'm quoting, "But when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?" And that's a question. And the implication is he won't. Now, again, this is not the full-blown rapture and in the period of the Great Tribulation with a capital T and all that. But what it is, I really don't know. Now, we'll run across in another one of these minor sections another thing that adds to this. And so the only conclusion that I can come to is that shortly before the end of time, there will be a period in which evil will seem to have triumphed. Now, don't go and do what some people do with that. And that is, when they look around, they say, well, this is the greatest evil in the world, so that must be that a week from next Tuesday, the end is going to come. Two things are wrong with that. This is not the worst time that the world has ever seen. You ought to read Barbara Tuchman's book on the 14th century and see what really is when over a third of the population of the Western European world died in less than a year. Now, we don't have anything that comes close to that. Or you read a description of the absolute evil of the gladiatorial games and the sex shows that went on in the Colosseum. And it makes television look like Sesame Street. So that's the first thing that's wrong. This isn't the worst time. And secondly, if it were, God in the form of Jesus himself says, you wouldn't know it anyway. In other words, he says that you will not know when the Son of Man is going to return. And so I don't ever get upset by people who are going to predict the end of the world. I know it's not going to happen when they say. Because he says when you least expect it, like a householder, that a burglar comes. If he had known when the burglar was coming, he would have stopped it. And that's pretty good reasoning. So don't interpret what I've said that way. But I will come back that there is some teaching that it'll be an awfully bad time.
It seems to me that as the world has more and more an opportunity to hear the gospel, and that's one of the things that Jesus said would happen, that all four corners of the earth, you might say, would hear the gospel. Mm-hmm. That there also becomes to a point where the world will not accept it. And that, in a sense, that finishes our mission here. Because once you get to that point of spreading the gospel, and then then the world does not accept it, there's nothing more we can do.
Jesse, that sounds good, and it probably is true. But I'm not sure that's what this is talking about.
No, I'm talking about accumulation of what we've talked about in the past classes of Revelation.
Yeah, what I want to tell you is...
Probably won't know that either.
What?
Probably won't know that either.
What I want to tell you is that do not use speculative interpretations as if they were the Word of God. Now I'm coming down to that point. That's the point that I wanted to make out of all this. While honoring the meaning of the text, I still want you to have that idea. Okay. When he given the key to the shaft of the abyss. When he opened the abyss, smoke rose from it like the smoke from a gigantic furnace. The sun and sky were darkened by the smoke from the abyss. And out of the smoke, locusts came down upon the earth and were given power like that of scorpions of the earth. They were told not to harm the grass of the earth or any plant, but only those people who did not have the seal of God on their foreheads. Now, what does this refer back to?
Exodus.
What?
Is it a lot like Exodus?
Well, yes, but I'm talking about in the book of Revelation.
Okay.
Where we talked about the sealing of the 144,000.
When it talks about the sealing the people. First, the 144,000 of Israel, and then countless millions and millions and millions. But now, all right, I'm going to ask you a question. What will harm unbelievers that won't harm believers? Because that's exactly what this says.
God's wrath?
You're getting close, girl. That's pretty good. I like that. Anybody? But can you do any better? Anybody else? Anybody want to hazard again?
Tom did.
Well, Satan
Tom did
can run
great.
them, he can't run us.
Well, that's what they said. But what does this mean in real time and real history? What? That's true, but we will die. What? The first death, not the second.
Doesn't it mean that there's a lot of people who accept the seal, unless it's given by God, that it would be by the devil, and then you'd be in their hands?
What was that
In
like?
the hands of the devil.
Yes, that is a good summary of this. What I think, you hear, is this probably has to do with a bad conscience. That people who do not have the assurance of the hope of God.
Hope versus hopelessness.
What?
Hope versus
Yes,
hopelessness.
it's hopelessness. That's another way you can talk about it. That if you do not have the hope of the promise of God, remember that the writer of Hebrews says hope is the anchor of the inner person, the soul, the real life. So this represents the fact that despair. Who said despair? Was it you? Okay.
Hopelessness is what I...
Hopefully, okay. Well, maybe despair would be a good term. That despair is right next door to all people who do not have the assurance of faith, to use a Pauline expression.
And that will be what distinguishes us, the believer from the unbeliever.
Yes.
Our hope.
Yes.
Our hopelessness.
And that's hope. Okay. See how we reach these conclusions? We let the metaphors lead us into a biblical concept. I believe that's one thing that you can get from Hendrickson that you just don't get from very many other commentators on the book of Revelation. Okay, he goes ahead then. They were not given power to kill them, but only to torture them for 5 months. Now, 5 months.
Limited again.
What?
Limited again.
Limited. Now, even despair is limited. I saw in the paper today that, what's his name, Williams, that committed suicide, he had a brain condition that led to despair and twisted thinking and all, that he did not have any alcohol or drugs in his blood, but they did discover from his genetic makeup that he had this fairly rare brain condition. And so even despair is limited, but there cannot be very many things that are more painful to experience than despair. It leads more people to commit suicide than any other single thing. That's one thing that is happening to returned soldiers from Iraq and Afghanistan, is that they get to the point of despair. There doesn't seem to be any way out from what their minds are trapped in. Now, I'm not saying they're all unbelievers and they're going to go to hell. You see, I have to make sure that people don't misunderstand where I'm coming from. But having flirted with despair a time or two, actually mine was anxiety produced, and thank God, literally, that when I needed an antidepressant, that my doctor gave me one that eliminated anxiety at the same time. And for the first time in 75 years of living as a semi-adult, I do not anymore feel anxious. And anxiety is just right next door to despair. I never felt suicidal, and I've always thanked God for that. But I did go to him and ask him why. And he never gave me any answer, but he gave me a solution when I was 85 years old. So
I remember you mentioning that you used to get like migraine, or you would go into some type of a manic state because if you didn't, something else would go worse.
well, no, here's the
I
thing.
remember you mentioned something like that.
I mentioned the fact that for years, every time I'd start to feel really good, then I'd have a migraine and wouldn't. And it wasn't until about 6 years ago or a little more, my counselor told me that, well, Charles, what it is, migraines stop manic phase of manic depressive psychosis in its tracks. And it's the manic phase that always gets people in trouble. So there was, see, what I thought was pain and punishment, God was taking care of me.
Like that.
Okay,
Pressure release.
there we are. We'll start there next time.